before birth was not the beginning. The liminal bardo and the architecture of human anxiety. We are accustomed to thinking of birth as a beginning. We mark it with dates, certificates, photographs, and celebrations. We tell ourselves a comforting story that life starts cleanly, decisively, at the moment the body enters the world. But what if that story is incomplete? What if birth is not a beginning at all, but a passage, a threshold crossed after a long and invisible journey? In Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in the ancient text known as the Bardo Thödol, often translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, existence is understood not as a single linear event, but as a sequence of transitions. Consciousness, according to this tradition, does not suddenly appear at conception nor vanish at death. Instead, it moves through intermediary states called bardos, intervals of transformation, where the structure of being itself is reconfigured. Among these states, there is one that concerns us profoundly today, what we might call the liminal. Bardo, the critical threshold immediately preceding birth. This is not merely a biological moment. It is not only a physiological process of uterine contractions, hormonal cascades, or neural maturation. It is, in Tibetan thought, the final existential gateway, the last moment in which consciousness exists without full material constraint, and the first moment in which it begins to collapse into form. From a modern scientific perspective, we describe this phase in terms of late-stage fetal stress responses, heightened sensory sensitivity, and rapid neurological reorganization. These descriptions are accurate but incomplete. The Bardo Thödol offers something different, an ontological map of this transition, a description not only of what happens to the body, but of what happens to being itself. And this is where the purpose of today's lecture becomes clear. We have spoken for decades about prenatal development using the language of biology alone. Cortisol levels, neural circuits, attachment theory, sensory priming. But what if these processes are also the first philosophical experiences of a human life? What if the fear, anxiety, and sense of separation that defines so much of adult psychology originate not merely in childhood, but at the very threshold of birth? This lecture asks three unsettling questions. Why does consciousness experience its deepest fear just before entering life? How are karmic or psychological tendencies reactivated at this moment? And why does the human condition begin with a sense of loss, rupture, and exile from wholeness? The Tibetan tradition identifies the pre-birth state as a point of inflection, a moment where consciousness bends, compresses, and acquires the structure it will carry for an entire lifetime. Let us examine this carefully. The liminal bardo as a structure of transformation. In Tibetan philosophy, there are traditionally 6 bardos, but beneath this classification lies a deeper pattern. Bardos are stages of transformation, moments when reality reorganizes itself. The liminal bardo is the final compression, the moment when consciousness crosses from boundlessness into density, from openness into constraint, from freedom into embodiment. Tibetan teachers describe this moment in striking terms. The light of appearance hardens. Karmic tendencies are compressed into form. The vast collapses into the particular. Western psychology, interestingly, approaches a similar conclusion from a different angle. Thinkers such as Erich Fromm argued that the fundamental anxiety of human life, the persistent sense of separation, insecurity, and world loss, originates not in social conditioning alone, but in the trauma of birth itself. The Bardo Thödol goes further. It identifies 6 transformations that occur at this threshold, not as biological accidents, but as the initial architecture of human consciousness. Let us consider them one by one. 1. The shock of contraction from infinity to finitude. In the Bardo state between lives, consciousness is described as expansive, unbounded, and free from gravity or form. There is no enclosure, no resistance, no pressure. But as birth approaches, this changes abruptly. Consciousness undergoes its first radical contraction, from vastness to narrowness, from openness to enclosure, from freedom to density. Physiologically, this corresponds to the compression of the birth canal and the force of uterine contractions. Ontologically, however, it represents something far more profound, the first encounter with limitation. The Bardo Thödol calls this moment the first contact between consciousness and bodily constraint. This experience leaves an imprint. It offers a compelling explanation for why human beings are so prone to claustrophobia, panic under pressure, and anxiety in confined or overwhelming situations. What feels like an irrational fear may, in fact, be an echo of the moment when infinity was forced into form. This is not merely physical stress. It is an existential descent. 2. The symbolic collapse of the world. For the unborn being, the womb is not perceived as an environment. It is perceived as the world itself, total, complete, undivided. There is no inside and outside, no self and other, no separation. As birth approaches, this world begins to disintegrate. The Tibetan tradition describes this as the dissolution of the spiritual space and the emergence of a new realm. This is not simply change, it is world loss. The familiar collapses, stability vanishes. What once felt eternal reveals itself as temporary. Modern psychology calls the residue of this experience basic anxiety, a deep-seated fear that the world can fall apart without warning, that safety is provisional, that belonging is fragile. Every later experience of loss, upheaval, or radical change resonates with this original collapse. This moment marks the first great reorganization of meaning. 3. The birth of separation and the emergence of the self. According to the Bardo Thödol, consciousness cannot enter embodied life without passing through separation. Until this point, there is no I, there is only continuity. But pressure, rupture, and expulsion introduce something unprecedented, the sense of being other than the world. I am not what surrounds me. This is the embryonic structure of the self. The quality of this separation matters profoundly. A gradual, regulated separation tends to produce emotional stability and secure attachment. A sudden or violent separation may give rise to anxious attachment, defensive structures, or aggression. Tibetan teachers refer to this as the first shaping of karmic tendencies. Developmental psychology echoes this insight, describing early separation as the template for all later relational patterns. The way we love, fear, intimacy, or withdraw from others often traces back to this moment. 4. The opening of the senses, preparing to receive a world. At the threshold of birth, consciousness begins to open its sensory gates. Tibetan texts describe this as the moment when light enters awareness. Scientifically, this aligns with heightened auditory sensitivity, tactile responsiveness, and accelerated neural connectivity in late-stage fetal development. Consciousness senses before understanding that a world is about to arrive. The configuration of this sensory awakening shapes lifelong tendencies. Auditory dominance may incline one toward language or music. Tactile sensitivity may produce heightened bodily awareness. Intense sensory arousal may correlate with emotional sensitivity or anxiety. Muted sensory activation may support analytical distance and emotional restraint. In Tibetan terms, this is the preparation of the stage upon which karmic patterns will later perform. 5. The imprinting of maternal emotion. The first emotional inheritance. The Bardo Thödol states, "The soul inherits traces of the body's memory and emotion." This is not genetics alone. It refers to the emotional atmosphere surrounding the unborn child. Modern science confirms that late pregnancy stress alters cortisol levels, reshapes the fetal HPA axis, and influences the sensitivity of emotional regulation circuits. In Tibetan language, these imprints are called the first emotional karma of life. Whether a person is predisposed toward calm, anxiety, melancholy, or vigilance may be influenced here before a single word is spoken. The fetus is not merely growing, it is learning emotion. The Tibetan tradition does not treat birth as a biological accident. It treats it as the final calibration of existence, the moment when consciousness acquires its lifelong structure. These 6 transformations are not incidental. They form the blueprint of the human condition. To understand ourselves, to understand our fears, attachments, anxieties, and longings, we may need to look not only backward to childhood, but further still to the threshold, where consciousness first learned what it meant to be human. In the next part of this series, we will examine each of these transformations in greater depth and explore how they continue to shape adult psychology, relationships, and existential meaning. In the previous segment, we explored the liminal bardo as the most fragile and decisive threshold of existence, the moment when consciousness contracts, the old world collapses, separation is born, the senses prepare to open, and emotional imprints are first engraved. But one question remains unanswered. If all these transformations prepare the ground, what then is finally planted? At the very end of this liminal passage, Tibetan Buddhism places what it considers the most decisive event of all, the final activation and alignment of karmic tendencies carried from previous lives. This is the 6th transformation, and it is here, just before birth, that the conditions of a new life are sealed. The 6th transformation, karmic tendencies awaken and a life takes shape. The Bardo Thödol treats this final phase with particular gravity. Just before entering the physical world, consciousness undergoes what Tibetan masters describe as a final ordering, a last alignment of tendencies, impulses, emotional residues, and unresolved forces carried across lifetimes. This is not a moment of moral judgment, nor is it a fully conscious choice in the modern sense. Rather, it is best understood as a compression process. The kind of existential data file is closed and saved. In this moment, consciousness settles almost inevitably into certain defaults. Which personality tendencies will dominate? Which fears and desires will form the central axis of experience? Which moral inclinations will feel natural or strained? Which unresolved tasks will seek repetition? The Tibetan tradition refers to this as alignment with one's karmic vibration, a resonance rather than a decision. Thus, this stage is not governed by free will alone, but by attraction, the pull of unfinished patterns towards similar conditions. Tibetan teachers describe this moment poetically as the instant when the soul takes the map of its next life into its hands. Karma as configuration, not punishment. In Western discourse, the word karma is often misunderstood, treated as a system of reward and punishment administered by a moral universe. The Bardo Thödol presents something far subtler. Karma here is not judgment, it is configuration. If previous karmic patterns were largely harmonious, the new life tends toward emotional stability, generosity, and ease. If many patterns remain unresolved, anxiety, hesitation, and attachment intensify. If violence or domination dominated previous trajectories, anger and reactivity surface more easily. If ascetic restraint prevailed, tendencies towards self-control and inhibition emerge. In other words, the being that approaches birth is not a blank slate. It is a condensed seed of consciousness, carrying long histories in compressed form. Conclusion of the 6 transformations. Biology ends where ontology begins. At this point, we must pause and clarify something essential. The 6 stages we have examined are not merely biological events. They are ontological structures, the deep architecture of becoming human. Pressure and contraction become the first experience of limitation. The collapse of the old world becomes the template for loss and impermanence. Separation gives rise to the self. Sensory awakening prepares the reception of reality. Maternal emotional imprinting establishes effective baselines. And karmic activation sets the existential agenda. Together, these 6 processes complete the basic structure of a human being. The Bardo Thödol expresses this with unsettling clarity. You decide much before you are born. Therefore, to understand a human life, it is not enough to examine education, culture, or postnatal environment alone. We must also look backward to the moment when consciousness narrowed, worlds collapsed, and the final blueprint was set. This, according to Tibetan Buddhism, is the most important threshold of all, the bardo between life and life, where existence itself takes form. Returning to the threshold, the fear of contraction and the first collision with matter. Now, let us move deeper into the mechanics of this. Threshold, beginning again with contraction. The Bardo Thödol describes the soul's descent toward a new body as passing through something like a violent storm or pressure field. This fear, it insists, does not come from outside. It arises from the experience of narrowing itself. From the vast openness of the bardo, consciousness is suddenly compressed, wide to narrow, base to point. In late fetal development, the body experiences increasing uterine pressure, rhythmic contractions, and spatial limitation. Biology calls this mechanical stress. Tibetan philosophy calls it the first shock of gravity. This fear has 2 layers. 2 layers of pre-birth fear. First, material fear. This includes physical compression, fluctuations in oxygen supply, and the activation of primal survival mechanisms. These reactions form the template of the human stress response. Second, existential fear. This is the terror of finitude itself, the loss of boundless freedom, and the imprisonment within form. The Bardo Thödol identifies this as the origin of what it calls primordial fear. Later in life, this fear resurfaces as claustrophobia, crowd anxiety, panic under pressure, or extreme reactions to confinement. These are not irrational reactions. They are echoes, the collapse of the inner world. From Bardo freedom to material gravity, Bardo consciousness is described as non-material, expansive, and boundaryless. As birth approaches, this inner world collapses. Tibetan teachers summarize this paradoxically. The old world must fall apart for the new one to open. From a biological perspective, the fetal environment becomes unstable. Space narrows, hormonal signals change, maternal stress is transmitted, and external stimuli begin to intrude. From an ontological perspective, the protective membrane of the bardo dissolves. Consciousness loses a world before it gains another. This is the first experience of existential instability, the birthplace of what psychology later calls basic anxiety. The first separation, the birth of not me. Separation is the most primitive form of suffering. Before birth, there is no clear distinction between self and world. The womb is not an environment, it is totality. As pressure and expulsion begin, consciousness experiences something unprecedented. I am not what surrounds me. This is the first boundary. Tibetan texts describe this as the first demarcation required to enter the world of form. The quality of this separation leaves lifelong traces. Gentle separation tends towards secure attachment. Painful separation toward anxiety and defensiveness. Violent separation toward anger and aggression. These are not merely psychological traits. They are the aftershocks of an ontological event. Preparing the senses, loading the world into consciousness. Standing at the boundary between light and matter, consciousness prepares to receive sensation. Tibetan masters call this the moment when the colors of the world begin to seep into awareness. Science confirms heightened sensory responsiveness at this stage. Auditory sensitivity, tactile awareness, neural acceleration. But philosophically, this is something else entirely. It is the moment when the soul selects how it will meet reality. Sensory sensitivity, dullness, dominance, or balance all become enduring traits. The senses are not merely biological receptors. They are the chosen doors through which the world will enter. Maternal emotion and the engraving of feeling. The Bardo Thödol teaches that consciousness inherits emotional traces from the body it enters. Modern science speaks of fetal programming stress hormones, crossing the placental barrier and shaping neural regulation systems. From the Bardo perspective, this is the last channel through which karmic tendencies may be softened or intensified. A calm maternal field quiets karmic turbulence. A distressed field ignites dormant tendencies. Thus, maternal emotion becomes one of the most powerful external forces, shaping a life's trajectory. Karmic realignment, the blueprint of a life. Finally, we return to the central theme of this section. The Bardo Thödol emphasizes that just before birth, consciousness enters a period of karmic realignment, the final rearrangement of past experience and future possibility. This is not memory in the ordinary sense. It is pattern recognition. Tibetan masters define this moment as the last time karmic traces reorganize before embodiment. This realignment forms the default settings of a life. Karmic activation occurs in three primary dimensions: temperamental karma, environmental karma, existential or destiny-oriented karma. Let us begin with the first. Temperamental karma, when consciousness meets the nervous system. The Bardo Thödol refers to the nature of the soul as the lingering echo of consciousness. These echoes, habits of desire, emotion, reaction, persist as vibrational tendencies. During late fetal development, the nervous system is forming rapidly. At this moment, karmic patterns resonate with neural structures. Aggressive karmic tendencies may align with heightened sympathetic activation. Avoidant tendencies may strengthen vagal dominance. Dependent tendencies may heighten emotional sensitivity in prefrontal circuits. This is not genetic inheritance. It is resonance. In modern terms, this is the formation of innate temperament. The Tibetan conclusion is stark. The soul is not empty. Its traces bind themselves to biology. In the next segment, we will explore how environmental and destiny-oriented karma complete this blueprint, and how these ancient insights can illuminate modern psychology, trauma, and the structure of human freedom. If this inquiry challenges how you think about life, consciousness, and identity, I invite you to subscribe and share. Your engagement allows these questions to continue entering the world. Up to this point, we have explored how the soul's most primordial structures are shaped at the very threshold of birth, how fear, separation, sensory awakening, and emotional imprinting form what we might call the architectural foundations of human consciousness. But there is still one essential question left unanswered. If temperament, anxiety, attachment, and emotional sensitivity are already configured before birth, then where does destiny enter the picture? Where does environment intervene? And how does the soul's past, what Tibetan thought calls karma, become activated rather than merely stored? This brings us to the final and perhaps most decisive dimension of the liminal bardo, the awakening of karmic conditions through environment and destiny. Paragraph 3. Expanded Philosophical Lecture, English. Ladies and gentlemen, at the edge of birth, karma does not awaken in isolation. It awakens in dialogue with environment. 1. The awakening of environmental karma, when inner tendencies meet external conditions. In Tibetan philosophy, karma is never understood as a fixed script. It is better described as potential energy, a dormant configuration that requires the right conditions to express itself. The emotional state of the mother, the surrounding atmosphere, and the broader environment of gestation do not create karma, but they activate or soften karmic tendencies already present within the soul. There is a well-known Tibetan saying, "Karma shines only when it meets a trigger." In modern psychological language, we might say, predisposition requires context. Consider the following examples. A soul carrying unresolved patterns of anger from a previous existence when gestated within a mother who experiences chronic stress, resentment, or emotional volatility tends to awaken with a heightened reactivity to frustration. The karmic imprint resonates with the emotional field of the womb. The result is not merely temperament, it is a reinforced pattern of emotional response. By contrast, a soul whose karmic history is contemplative, introspective, or emotionally balanced, when nurtured within a calm and emotionally stable maternal environment, often preserves that equilibrium. Such individuals tend to display emotional steadiness, resilience, and adaptability from early life. In cases where a soul carries karmic imprints of fear, loss, or avoidance, and the maternal environment is similarly anxious or unstable, the developing nervous system becomes hyper-responsive. From a neurobiological perspective, this corresponds to heightened sensitivity in the HPA axis, the body's stress regulation system. From a philosophical perspective, it represents karma entering resonance with environment. Tibetan tradition describes this as the moment when the world sets fire to the soul's remaining tendencies. This is not moral judgment. It is resonance. Noise, conflict, violence, economic pressure, and emotional turbulence do not merely affect the fetus physiologically. They interact with karmic dispositions, intensifying sensitivity, defensiveness, or vigilance. Thus, environmental karma is not fate imposed from outside, but a meeting point between inner history and outer condition, a process through which a particular disposition becomes crystallized. 2. The awakening of destiny. Karma, the soul's final intuition before birth. Beyond temperament and environment lies a deeper layer still, what Tibetan philosophy refers to as destiny karma. According to the Tibetan understanding, in the final moments before birth, consciousness experiences a profound but fleeting intuition and awareness of where it is about to enter. This is not a rational choice. It is not deliberate planning. It is a gravitational pull shaped by karmic necessity. The soul senses which parents it will encounter, which social conditions it will enter, which historical moment it will inhabit. And through this sensing, it aligns itself with the conditions most conducive to its unresolved karmic task. In this sense, the Bardo functions as an ontological design phase, a moment in which the soul's remaining tendencies organize themselves into a coherent life trajectory. This is why Tibetan texts describe birth not as random arrival, but as directional entry. 3. What is chosen learning, suffering, and role? Tibetan philosophy identifies 3 dimensions of this final karmic alignment. First, what must be learned. Karma is oriented toward growth, not punishment. The soul gravitates towards circumstances that allow it to confront what remains unresolved. A soul marked by instability may enter a stable household to learn security. A soul shaped by aggression may enter restrictive environments to learn restraint. A soul burdened by dependence may choose strong parental figures to cultivate autonomy. These are not rewards or penalties. They are educational architectures of existence. Second, what kind of suffering must be traversed? In Tibetan Buddhism, suffering is not a moral sentence. It is a process of purification. A soul with karmic traces of loss may encounter environments of absence. A soul marked by conflict may enter relationally complex worlds. A soul shaped by desire may experience scarcity. These conditions are not chosen consciously. They are attracted through vibrational affinity. Third, what role must be embodied? Before birth, the soul intuitively senses its existential function, not a profession, but a mode of being, the healer, the mediator, the challenger, the solitary seeker, the catalyst of change. This is what we might call an ontological role, a way of inhabiting existence that shapes how one affects others and the world. 4. The ontological blueprint of a human life. When we bring these three layers together, a coherent structure emerges. Temperamental karma shapes the nervous system and emotional baseline. Environmental karma modulates and amplifies these tendencies. Destiny karma aligns the soul with life conditions, challenges, and roles. Together, they form what we may call an ontological blueprint. From this perspective, human life is not an accident. It is not a blank slate. Nor is it a rigid destiny. It is a designed continuity of consciousness, shaped by prior patterns, yet open to transformation. As the Tibetan Book of the Dead reminds us, much is chosen before birth. 5. The philosophical implication. Birth as rewriting, not beginning. This leads us to a final insight. Birth is not a beginning. It is a revision. Consciousness does not start anew. It reconfigures itself. Each life is a rewriting of unfinished sentences. From this angle, your anxiety, your attachment patterns, your emotional sensitivities, and even your recurring life challenges are not arbitrary flaws. They are signals of unfinished work, invitations to awareness. Life, then, is not something that happens to you. It is something consciousness continues to compose through you. If today's exploration of the Bardo has allowed you to see your life not as a series of random outcomes, but as a meaningful structure of becoming, then this lecture has served its purpose. Your life is not merely a result. It is a work in progress authored by consciousness itself. If you wish to continue exploring these philosophical maps of existence, this channel offers ongoing lectures that bridge classical wisdom, psychology, and contemporary thought. Your subscription and sharing help bring these questions to a wider audience. Questions not about what to believe, but about how to understand being human. Thank you for thinking with me today. Until our next lecture, let us continue to reflect and continue to become.